Big thank you to today's sponsor, ProtonVPN. Many of us feel like privacy is basically impossible these days, so you destroy your computer parts, you throw away all your stuff, you'll throw your computer case away, and you'll go live with the Amish. Since honestly, that feels like the only way to escape the big tech overlords from seeing everything you're doing and constantly collecting data. Best part is, it's not even big tech, it's your literal internet service provider, providing warrantless surveillance access to the National Intelligence Agency. Just because you live in a certain part of the world, you can't watch one of your favorite shows. If you want to change this, then ProtonVPN can help. ProtonVPN has servers all over the world, so you can connect to any part of the world to circumvent these restrictions, watch what you want, and when you use a VPN, your ISP can't see what you're doing. So anyone trying to look in can't see what you're up to. If you're interested, the link in the description will provide you a 64% off deal, which is a special deal provided to the entire Totally Not KO community. Thank you again to Proton for sponsoring today's video. I believe that open source means open to everyone. Freedom is what I think whenever I think open source. Unfortunately, many people disagree with me. And on that, I actually wrote an entire paper titled "The Modern Open Source Philosophy is Not Open Anymore." Now, I'm actually going to read it here, just in case if you don't want to go and just sit down and read it entirely by yourself. And I'll also give my little tidbits of thought as I read along. Now, I will say this, I'm not some kind of hardened veteran when it comes to open source. I've only been in open source for about maybe 2 years now. I've known about open source for like maybe 3 or 4 now, but I've only been involved for the last like 2. So frankly, I mean, I'm no veteran, I'm no expert in any of this sort of thing. I'm only 17 years old. You may think that my opinions were irrelevant as a result of that, and that's fine. And all I ask is that you withhold any of the mean, angry comments and the dislikes and anything like that. I ask that you just hold off and hear me out. So with that, I'll go ahead and start reading. So maybe I'm the odd one out. It certainly feels that way as of recent. More and more, what passes for open in open source feels closed off, gated not by code, but by culture, politics, and ideology. The word open was supposed to mean true freedom, to use, to build, to share. Instead, it comes with strings attached, debates over purity, and an endless cycle of gatekeeping dressed up as virtue. Open source once invited anyone in. You didn't need to pass a test, sign a manifesto, or pledge loyalty to a philosophy. You just needed the curiosity and the willingness to create. That was enough. Today, it often feels like contributing requires more than code. It requires adopting the right beliefs, aligning with the right tribe, and speaking the right language. And this is so true for projects that have deeply involved politics. Now, if you watch my older videos, you know my take on this. I don't believe that open source belongs. I don't believe that politics belongs in open source. And it's because politics is the complete opposite of open. It's literally dividing people. Like, quite literally, that's what it is, fundamentally. So as soon as you start involving that, it just alienates users, and it's not open. And also, there's a whole thing about professionalism in open source, and if you want your project to be widely adopted, and you don't add that personal shit into your professional. We don't speak politics at the dinner table, boys. When you go to work, when you go to your job, you don't start talking about politics there, because it's a professional scenario. That's just impolite. It's unprofessional. But many people disagree with that. And frankly, I mean, it is open source, but still, I believe that is not truly open source. Now, I actually made a whole video talking about that. If you want to go, if you really want to hear deep, like my whole opinion on that, and you also want to see examples of that and me just go deep talking about it, I made a whole video titled "Open Source." It's like politics and open source, some shit like that. You can find the video. Carrying on though. Viral licensing and its destruction of open source's sustainability. Open source was never meant to be a walled garden. That is, in fact, the opposite of open. And I full-heartedly agree with this. It's every day more and more I see open source just becoming its own little walled garden, separate from everything else. So open source is supposed to be its own completely separate and fully independent ecosystem where the outside can't come in and the inside can't go out. I mean, that's not open. That's the total opposite of open. Yet viral licensing and the culture that props it up has turned parts of the ecosystem into exactly that. Open source has become gated communities where participation is conditional and where corporations are treated not as potential allies but as parasites. I've seen respected developers dismiss permissive licensing as a disease, the Bazite developers specifically. That one word alone captures the rot at the heart of modern open source's culture. When freedom itself, the freedom to use code without strings, the freedom to build without obligation, is treated as something contagious and harmful, the philosophy has been turned on its head. The attitude doesn't just alienate corporations, which is the point. It alienates individuals too. It reduces open source to a circle jerk of ideological purity, where the measure of your contribution isn't its quality, but whether it complies with a license that dictates morality from the top down. Instead of expanding the ecosystem, viral licensing shrinks it. Instead of empowering users and developers, it locks them into a philosophy they may not even share. And this is a absolutely crucial problem. I mean, the GPL license, I have a big problem with the GPL license, if you couldn't already tell. And projects like the NixOS project have a big problem with trying to force and push their philosophies and their beliefs on other people and trying to dictate morality. And they literally had a whole they literally called it a Nazi purge. They purged, they kicked out their founder, forced him to resign, and then they purged a bunch of members who they called Nazis. And it's all because they just had different beliefs than the core team. It's insane. I'll leave you to look into that yourself. Corporate hostility and the cost of driving them out. If viral hostility built the legal walls, and corporate hostility built the cultural moat. Somewhere along the way, open source turned from welcoming corporate support to spitting in its hand. Corporations are cast as parasites, vultures feeding off the labor of true believers. Open source feels almost cult-like now. It's crazy, and many people, as I'll even go on to say, don't even realize how much corporations actually prop up and keep open source alive. Like, go look at any major open source foundation, the Linux Foundation, the Open Source Initiative itself. And I have my own personal beliefs and criticisms against the OSI. I think the OSI is a joke of an organization, but we're not going to get into that. This is self-destructive arrogance. The inconvenient truth is that corporations have always been the lifeblood of open source. The Linux kernel is propped up by engineers at Intel, Red Hat, and countless others on their employer's payroll. Kubernetes would not exist without Google. Apache, PostgreSQL, LLVM, all of which became cornerstones of modern computing, precisely because companies adopted them, invested in them, and paid people to maintain them. That was all made possible by the corporations that people claim are destroying open source, and how proprietary is the end of the world and is terrible. It's scum of the earth. It's like, dude. And yet open source bites the hand that feeds it. It demonizes the very actors that turn experiments into infrastructure, that turn fragile projects into industry standards. Open source is killing itself through a toxic culture that treats corporate involvement as corruption rather than contribution. Now, let's be clear, blind arrogance, blind dependence on corporations is not healthy either. We've seen projects warp their priorities, compromise principles, or collapse entirely when a sponsor pulls out. But acknowledging that risk is not the same as rejecting corporate support altogether. The reality is that without adoption, open source, without payrolls, funding, maintainers, without companies hardening and deploying these tools at scale, most open source projects would wither into obscurity. And we've seen this happen. GitHub is a graveyard. Go look at the amount of projects on GitHub that are just started by a compassionate developer and then just abandoned because the developer just doesn't have the fucking mental capacity, doesn't give a shit enough, because I mean, they frankly don't have any incentive to keep working on it, and then the few users they have are shouting demands, tossing, you know, demands at them, and there's such high expectations for these people who are doing it out of the kindness of their own hearts, and it's just such a toxic cycle. Whether we like it or not, though, the world doesn't run on altruism. It runs on shared interests, incentives, and mutual benefit. That's how business works. And that's the funny part. That's how the world turns. That's how everything works in this world. And you can't just believe that things are built entirely off the goodwill of people, the kindness of hearts. That's not how the world works. It's mutual interests, it's mutual benefit, shared interests, and incentives. That's how the world works. And open source has to work the same way. And open source, if it wants to survive, must learn to work the same way. Pretending that code can live forever on goodwill alone is a fantasy. Projects burn out, maintainers quit, and communities fracture when reality catches up. We've seen this happen with X11, by the way. But just fork it. But people will just use something else. The laziest defenses of a collapsing model right there, and I've heard them a million times. Forks are not free. They just split communities, duplicate effort, and drain already thin resources. The X11, it's X Libre, I think is what the X Libre project is a fantastic project, because the people behind Wayland were trying to absolutely just kill and die off X11. And I mean, people want options. You can't just have a single option. Having X11 and Wayland is a good thing. Not having a singular option, just Wayland. And there's many problems with Wayland. The X11, there's so much about it that was such a... You can go see that whole situation. It's such a tragic situation. And they're trying to revive it with X Libre. I think that's a fantastic thing, but that comes at a cost. You know, it's just make a fork is completely ignoring the fact that making a fork means maintaining it. It means running the whole thing, running the entire project, dealing with all of that burden. Adopting someone else's code base and then having to adapt and build upon it yourself is also 10 times more difficult than just writing it yourself. And it's a challenging thing, especially giant code bases like X11. I mean, that's such a monumental task. Just use something else is even worse too, and X11 really applies here. It treats years of labor as disposable, as if abandoning a project is a victory rather than a complete failure. I saw this exact thing happen with the X11 project. They were like, just use Hyperland. You know, Hyperland's just better, just use Hyperland, all this stuff. And they're treating it like it's a victory that X11's basically been fully abandoned and is being replaced. That's a complete and utter failure. And I'm tired of people seeing it as otherwise. That's just not true. That is such an upside down worldview. Both arguments are cop-outs designed to avoid facing the real problem, a behavior commonly seen in modern open source culture. You see this everywhere. The sustainability crisis. Open source is straining under the weight of its own success. Entire industries depend on libraries and tools maintained by a handful of unpaid developers. We've already seen the cracks, by the way. Heartbleed exposed the world to a catastrophic risk because OpenSSL, securing most of the internet, was maintained by 2 underfunded engineers. If you want to look at OpenSSL Heartbleed, it's a crazy situation. Heartbleed is a serious vulnerability in certain versions of OpenSSL, and this was discovered in 2014. It allowed attackers to read sensitive data from the memory of affected system, exposing private keys and whatnot. And this was a major vulnerability, and so much core critical infrastructure across the globe uses OpenSSL, and it was maintained by 2 underfunded engineers. Isn't that insane? How fragile the world is, how fragile this internet that we have is. Log4j triggered a global panic because a volunteer-run logging library carried the weight of the entire enterprise world. You guys remember that whole situation? You could type a message in Minecraft chat and launch code on someone else's computer, or any other program that was Java-based and used Log4j. You could literally run arbitrary code just by typing some shit. It's crazy. And that entirely happened just because it's this small team of people who are just underappreciated, underpaid. It's entirely volunteer ran, and these people are supposed to carry the weight of the entire enterprise world. It's tragic. And it's inevitable too. A culture that prides itself on free code while scorning investment created the perfect conditions for collapse. Dependency chains stretch across the globe, but responsibility never scales with them. Everyone takes, but few gives. And here's the fun part. And here's where the defenders rush in with their favorite retort. That's why we need strong copyleft. That's why we need viral licenses. That's why we must demand contributions back. Viral licenses! But this doesn't solve the problem, it amplifies it. Forcing reciprocity, Jesus fucking Christ, I think I have dyslexia, doesn't build sustainability, it strangles adoption. Code bound by viral licensing doesn't attract contributors, it drives them away, especially corporations. And this is very simply put. If you provide me something that I need to build my business, and my business is built atop your work, then I am therefore dependent on your project. And as time goes on, as computer modernizes, as we advance in technology, as technology grows, your project needs to grow with it for my company to be sustainable. I need to invest in you and your project because you are vital to my business and it is a worthwhile investment. That's how business works. But people seem to not understand that. Forcing reciprocity, I think I said it again, doesn't build sustainability. I read that already, actually. Code bound by, I already read that too. And when corporations leave, resources vanish, adoption stalls, and the cycle of fragility repeats itself. The cure becomes the disease. And this is so true for open source projects. I mean, it's corporations you should see them as a way to get funding for your project, to expand, to grow, to become even bigger and greater and do even better things. But instead, people go and just like absolutely dismiss corporations because, oh, proprietary, oh man, them proprietary, they're building on my work. They're building on my work, making money off my work, and I get nothing in return. Man, that's open source, dipshit. That implies that you expect shit in return for what you're doing. And that's not how open source works. But I'll carry on because I get into that. This is the great irony. Sustainability doesn't collapse because people fail to give back enough code. It collapses because the entire model runs on borrowed labor with no lasting infrastructure. You can mandate, I'm just not going to try to pronounce that word. I am all over the place today. All you want, but it doesn't fix the fact that critical infrastructure is maintained by volunteers with no safety net. The problem isn't who contributes back. The problem is that the system itself was never built to last. There's a fundamental problem with the system itself, and just demanding contributions isn't going to fix it. Now, here's what I like to call the real open source definition. OSI, fuck you. This is the real open source definition. The tragedy of modern open source is that the word open has been stolen. It no longer means freedom, it means footnotes. It means obligations, conditions, and endless arguments about who is pure enough to participate. What should be an invitation has become a contract. But the real definition of open source is brutally simple. Freedom without strings. Freedom to use code however you want. Freedom to build on it without fear of legal infection. Freedom to share it without asking for permission from an ideology. That's it. No moral tests, no forced reciprocity. I still think I'm saying that wrong. No cultural checkpoints, just the radical idea that sharing code makes the world better. That's what I believe the true meaning of open source is. Now, if we actually go to Raven, actually I think it's github.com, Raven dev team, and I'll go ahead and open this up for you. If I go ahead and show you this, you can see we have our license. Yeah, BSD3 license. It's so simple. Basically, you just have to keep this copyright notice. If you distribute this, keep the copyright notice. And you can't use our names to endorse your product. You can't say that we like endorse your product or anything. So you can't say, oh, Raven, you know, is a part of this project or what. No. Just keep this copyright notice, because we do want, you know, that much credit for our work. And you can't use our name to promote your product without permission. And it's provided as is, and there's no warranty, so if any shit blows up or whatever, it's not our fault. That's all the BSD3 clause is. This is the most open source license. BSD3 clause is the open source license. It is the most open source license. In fact, I'd go as so far as to say they should honestly just rename it to the open source license, because this is as open source as this shit gets. The only thing I'd say is more open source than this is fucking public domain. but obviously I want to make sure I'm covered legally, and I want to make sure that people aren't going to be using my name for any other bullshit. So that's all it is. And you have to have this copyright little notice right here, just somewhere in your project. It can be in a notice.txt file, whatever else. And that's it. I even have references right here if you want to go check out these sources. These are all good reads. I would recommend them. And that's it. So whether or not you agree with me or whatever, I read the comments. So if you want to post your thoughts, I will read them. Like it if you like it, dislike it if you dislike it. I mean, this is just my take on open source, and I believe that open source has just strayed so far from what it really means to be open source. That's about it.